You should have heard that the EU has been arguing for several months about whether to impose additional taxes on China's new energy vehicles. In fact, the attitude within the EU has always been quite divided. Some countries think that raising taxes is a good idea to protect the local automobile industry. But some people think that doing so will anger China and even trigger terrible counter-sanctions. But in August of this year, the EU decided to impose additional taxes on Chinese new energy vehicles sold in the European market. This makes many people feel that the EU is seriously competing with China. But no one expected that the EU's sanctions not only failed to scare China, but gave Russia a great opportunity. The market cake that originally belonged to the EU. Now Russia has seized the opportunity and reached an agreement with China. So the question is, why does the EU insist on raising taxes on China? And what benefits has Russia gained from it? If you like our video content, please click to subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can receive all our latest video content. Now, let's get into today's topic. In the field of new energy vehicles, competition has become increasingly fierce in recent years. In some key disruptive technologies, the gap between Europe and China and the United States is getting bigger and bigger. It is understood that China's electric vehicles and battery technology have performed well, and the price is more advantageous than similar products in Europe. In general, Chinese-made models are about 20% cheaper than those produced in the EU. This situation has allowed China to export electric vehicles to occupy 12% of the EU market in 2023, and it is expected that this proportion may exceed 18% by 2025. Faced with such pressure, the EU has been implementing a series of economic security and supply chain security strategies since last year, with the aim of reducing its strategic dependence on China. In this de-risking process, the French government is particularly aware that in order to remain competitive in the global new energy vehicle market, it cannot be left far behind by competitors such as China and must increase its market share. In response to this challenge, France joined some EU countries in June this year to impose tariffs of 17.4%, 20% and 38.1% on several major Chinese automakers, including BYD, Geely, and SAIC Group. In addition, a 21% tariff was generally imposed on some other manufacturers. According to the European Commission, if no company requests a hearing within 10 days, or if a hearing is filed but no majority objection is obtained, the proposal will be passed. Basically, this means that the EU's taxation of Chinese electric vehicles is almost a foregone conclusion, and the final measures are expected to be implemented within 4 months after the implementation of the temporary tax. In fact, the EU's tariff increase this time will make the cost pressure of Chinese electric vehicles exported to Europe unprecedented. Data shows that currently in 28 European countries, 20% of newly registered electric vehicles are made in China. In 2023, China's total automobile exports reached 4.6 million, of which about 900,000 were new energy vehicles. The total value of these vehicles exported to Europe was as high as $11.5 billion, accounting for nearly 57% of China's total automobile exports. Although it seems that Chinese automakers still have a lot of room for growth in their market share in Europe, and their performance in the EU market is also very impressive, with exports growing by more than 100% year-on-year. But now the situation is getting a little complicated. With the implementation of the EU's new tariff policy, the price of Chinese cars in Europe will rise further, which will undoubtedly widen the price gap with local European cars. For any company, if it is in a state of no profit or even loss for a long time, it is difficult to continue to operate. Faced with the EU's tough attitude on the issue of automobile taxation, Beijing will certainly not sit idly by, and they have taken countermeasures before. Starting in June 2024, China launched an anti-dumping investigation on pork exported from the EU, covering pork and its byproducts from the EU. This is definitely a big blow to many EU countries, because China is an important market for their pork exports. As one of the most populous countries in the world, China consumes more than 55 million tons of pork each year, accounting for almost half of global consumption. Although China itself is also a major pork producer, it still needs to import a large amount of pork every year to make up for the domestic demand gap. And this import volume is increasing year by year. As far as I know, most of the pork imported by China currently comes from some EU countries, such as Spain, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Denmark. Pork products from these countries usually make good profits in the Chinese market. However, with the implementation of anti-dumping duties, these countries may gradually lose this important market. Take Spain as an example. As one of the main pork exporters in the EU, its pork exports to China reached 560,000 tons in 2023. If anti-dumping measures are really implemented, the Spanish pork industry may face losses of about $400 million. In addition, industry experts also predict that the pork market share of the entire EU may decline sharply, and sales volume is likely to drop sharply from the current stable state, with a drop of 30% to 40%. At the same time, prices will also be greatly affected, and the previous price advantage will no longer exist. It is expected that pork prices will rise by at least 20%. For those EU pork producers who are highly dependent on the Chinese market, this is definitely a big blow. In this tense situation, EU countries such as Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Hungary have stood up to oppose the EU's policy of imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. It is worth mentioning that China's anti-dumping investigation on pork against the EU had not been immediately implemented at that time. In order to ease the situation, the German Minister of Economy actively promoted dialogue between China and Europe, especially on the sensitive topic of the EU's plan to impose additional tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Despite the negotiations between the two sides, the EU finally made only some minor adjustments on the tariff issue. SAIC's tariff was reduced from the original 38.1% to 36.3%, which is still the highest among all manufacturers. BYD's tariff was reduced from 17.4% to 17%. The EU said that the main reason for imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles is that it believes that the Chinese government has provided too many subsidies to domestic car companies, and it is almost impossible to significantly reduce tariffs. Now, the issue has reached a deadlock. To stop the EU's decision, at least 15 member states need to vote against it. But judging from the previous voting situation within the EU, there are only 4 countries that clearly oppose it, which is far from the required number. So, in the end, European countries decided to impose high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. However, what is interesting is that when China decided to sanction European pork, Russia immediately took action and began to sign a large number of trade contracts with Chinese pork suppliers. Russian pork companies also responded positively and welcomed China to increase cooperation with them to ensure the smooth export of pork to China. According to the Chinese customs, in August this year, China has signed contracts with 3 Russian pork export companies, and now about 50,000 to 60,000 tons of pork have been exported to China. At the same time, Russia also said that if China implements anti-dumping measures on EU pork products, their pork will quickly fill the gap. The head of the Russian Pig Farming Enterprise Union also revealed that they intend to occupy 10% of China's pork import market in the next 3 to 4 years. This means that European pork companies will not only suffer huge losses, but may even be completely kicked out of the Chinese market. For those European pork companies that rely heavily on the Chinese market, this is simply a devastating blow. In contrast, the concerns of EU countries are growing. German economic experts pointed out that if Russia successfully replaces the EU and becomes China's main pork supplier, the EU pork exporters will have to deal with the excess pork themselves. This will lead to oversupply in the market, and pork prices may fall sharply, which will have an impact on the entire European pork market. Overall, the EU's tariff restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles do not seem to have much impact on China, but they have a significant impact on European countries themselves. What is more noteworthy is that in addition to pork, many EU companies' products and brands rely on the Chinese market for sales. On August 20th, 2024, the European Commission announced the draft final decision on the anti-subsidy investigation of Chinese electric vehicles. Almost immediately afterwards, the Ministry of Commerce of China also issued an announcement stating that it would conduct an anti-subsidy investigation on dairy products imported from the EU. It is reported that the China Dairy and Dairy Products Association has submitted relevant applications to the Ministry of Commerce. After a preliminary investigation, the Ministry of Commerce felt that the evidence was indeed reasonable, so it officially filed a case on August 21st to launch an investigation. In addition, as early as May this year, one of Russia's largest dairy companies has begun to ship milk to China by rail. However, due to the long distance and complicated customs procedures, it takes a full 23 days from Moscow to China. The Russian side is also aware of this problem, and they said that they need to study better transportation methods. After all, if the transportation time is too long, the types of dairy products that can be exported will be limited, which is not very convenient for both China and Russia. Judging from the game between China and Europe this time, the EU originally wanted to use sanctions to hit China's electric vehicle industry, but it accidentally dragged some of its important supply chains into the water. Of course, China's countermeasures can be said to be very clever. It did not overreact and accurately hit the EU's pain points. The current situation is that these EU sanctions have given Russia a breathing space, allowing them to have room to strengthen their economy in the face of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and Western sanctions. At the same time, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has also begun anti-dumping investigations on EU products such as brandy and pork. If these investigation results confirm the problem, China is likely to impose anti-dumping duties on these EU products. In the end, who do you think is the real winner in this China-Europe game? To not miss out on our future projects and news updates, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We will continue to provide you with more exciting and interesting content.